So your work has long engaged with the politics of resource extraction and its ecological implications, from the book Resource Radicals that you published in 2020 to your forthcoming book Extraction: The Frontiers of Green Capitalism. And while your earlier research focused on Latin America, particularly Ecuador and Chile, your new book expands its scope to include the US and Europe. So to start with a broader perspective, how would you define extractivism in the first place? And how do you see it in relation to the longue durée of capitalism, and especially its colonial history and the ongoing dynamics of unequal exchange?
Yeah, so I'm going to start this by going to the origins of my analysis of extractivism, which also takes us to its origins as a discourse. I had the kind of serendipity, perhaps, of living in Latin America at a moment that this discourse was, in a way, first articulated. And so the first answer to your question is that extractivism, or extractivismo in Spanish, is a situated discourse. It emerged in a particular time, in a particular place, to respond to particular challenges on the left, and challenges of political economy and the mode of accumulation in the global south and in the peripheries of the world economy. So first and foremost, it's a critique. It's a critique of the way that capitalism appears in the peripheries of the world system. It appears as rapacious, as violent, as extractive, as the kind of term itself names. But as a mode of critique, it wasn't just externally oriented or oriented towards its object of critique, right? Like the world system, capitalism, in its kind of peripheral manifestation. It also named a divide on the left, right? And I think it's important to kind of retain that kind of local political aspect to it, right? When the activists and left intellectuals, critical intellectuals in Latin America started talking in terms of extractivism, part of what they were naming was a way in which even left-wing governments, even these progressive projects that occurred during the so-called pink tide, which was a moment when there was a lot of left-wing, we could almost call it political hegemony in Latin America, when we had leaders that were self-declared socialists, that were embarking on, in many ways, quite transformative policies. What critics and activists at the time sort of began to focus on was the way that, despite the revolutionary rhetoric in some cases, or the radical rhetoric, there was a reproduction of a mode of accumulation over time, that these leftists had not fundamentally departed from extractivism. And so what extractivism also calls our attention to is the kind of deep tension on the left, not only in Latin America, but also around the world, of how to grapple with the extractive foundations of the world economy, right? And sort of one mode of grappling with that is to kind of articulate left-wing policies that can change the political economy of extraction. Another is to more militantly, more fundamentally, perhaps more getting to the root of things, to oppose extractivism as a kind of mode of accumulation in and of itself, right? So extractivism kind of recalls that moment of political conflict among the left. It was initially this kind of localized critical discourse. And in that process, though, it articulated a political economy of extraction, and kind of drew our attention, and draws our attention still in this moment, to what extraction or extractivism is as a whole political economy, right? And so in doing that, these scholars and activists, and I say that intentionally, in that it was both a kind of intellectual discourse, but also very much a political discourse among social movement actors, right, who were protesting large-scale extractive projects that were being advanced under left-wing governments, right? And so in kind of this moment of this political clash, what is quite interesting to me, and I think quite relevant to our moment, is that these situated actors kind of brought into the 21st century the discourses of dependency theory, of structural economics, these concepts that you've pointed us to of, for example, unequal exchange, right, or enclave economies. These were concepts that were first developed in large part, but by no means exclusively, by Latin American leftists in the 1960s and 70s. And I say in large part because they were also co-created with third worldist projects in Africa, in South Asia, in the Middle East, right? So it wasn't Latin American alone, though for certain reasons that we could discuss, these discourses kind of dependency theory kind of first took hold in Latin America in a way before they kind of fully globalized. And what dependency theory draws our attention to is the position of formerly colonies, then kind of subservient states in the world system or peripheral states in the world system, their position in the world system, which is defined by extractive political economies, whether those are mining, whether those are large-scale agriculture, which may have at certain moments involved chattel slavery, right? And so these extractive operations that are basically about taking primary resources from their place of either their geological deposits or from where they are harvested in plantations out of these territories and exporting them to originally imperial centers and then subsequently also to kind of like global markets, right? Once we're in a kind of an era of sovereignty. And so you have large-scale extractive projects. They are export-oriented. There is often initially enslaved, coerced, and then kind of cheapened labor that kind of performs the labor necessary to get the minerals out of the ground or to get the cotton, out. And there's this way in which your entire kind of political economy is oriented towards the needs of imperial centers where the manufacturing and the value-added processes take place, and or to kind of global markets in a sort of maybe more abstracted way, right? And so you are dependent because the kind of internal workings of your economy, the needs for certain raw materials, the volumes at which they are needed, the specific raw materials that are needed, those are all determined by productive processes that happen elsewhere, right? And so what you are left behind in these places, in these peripheries, and we could talk about this in the 16th century or today, is resource drain. So your resources, especially if they're non-renewable, on human timescales at least, just like leave your borders. And you are left behind with the kind of a volatile economy that kind of booms and busts along with global markets or along with the needs of manufacturers elsewhere. You are left behind with social and ecological devastation, right? So it's not just unequal economic exchange, it's also unequal ecological exchange. And you are also, there is a legacy in addition of a kind of state apparatus, initially one designed by the imperial core. Then, after sovereignty and independence, there are, of course, like nationalist political movements that make important changes to those systems. But the political apparatus, by design, is to serve this process of extraction, export, subservience, right? So extractivism also calls our attention to the kind of simultaneity of political sovereignty in the global south and economic subservience, like the lack of economic sovereignty, even if politically you are technically sovereign. And yeah, so, I think that I wouldn't want to paint too broad or kind of use too broad a brush to paint this picture, in the sense that I would be remiss to kind of imply that there is no change from the origins of violent colonial encounter to today. And I think we'll get into some of those fundamental changes in the global economy, which have actually very much unfolded in the kind of battlefields of extraction. Like extraction and the dynamics of it and the inequalities baked into it are part of what has actually motivated some of those transformations that in turn have made important shifts in this political economy. But there's quite a bit of continuity, and that's what the initial architects of this discourse were pointing us towards, that across seemingly major changes, whether sovereign independence or the rise of left-wing governments, you have a fundamental continuity in the mode of capital accumulation, and there are differences between how capital accumulates in the peripheries and then how it accumulates globally, or there's differences, but also, of course, connections. So maybe I'll leave it there. Yeah.